Hello. To understand what is Azure Function, we first need to understand how a traditional server works. A traditional server is having a trigger point, which is usually a REST API that is coming from your browser and hits the server. If you want to manually set up this traditional server, then we need to make sure to have a virtual machine first and then install an operating system into it and have a hosting application on top of the operating system. And we are sole responsible for the security of that particular VM, the application updates which are all installed in that VM, and also the maintenance of it. On other hand, Azure Function takes care of all setup and maintenance related tasks of the VM on which our application code will run, and we need to only focus on the application code, and that's all. That's why the definition of Azure Function is a serverless compute service that enable user to run event trigger code without having to provision and manage the infrastructure. Along with this major benefit that Azure Function provide, we have more powerful features in Azure Function that are called triggers and bindings. What are triggers? Trigger can cause a function to run. In a traditional server, the trigger was the API service that was hitting to the server and the function code was getting executed. Here in Azure Function, we have multiple triggers. A trigger defines how a function is invoked, and a function must have exactly one trigger. On the other hand, we have another powerful feature called as bindings. Bindings are though optional, but binding to a function is a way to connect another Azure services. There can be a input binding or a output binding. Input binding is nothing but when a Azure function runs, it gets some parameterized data from one of the services which are allowed to connect to Azure as a binding. The function can process this input data from the other services, and as an output, it can provide the set of data to the output bindings or to other Azure services. As I earlier said, the data from the binding is provided to the function as parameters. Let's understand triggers and binding with some example scenarios. A message arrives at a message queue which runs function to write to another queue is nothing but a topic on which some data is passed in a microservices environment, and all the subscribers of that particular topic can read the data that is present on that topic. So I want that my function runs whenever a message arrives to a message queue on a particular topic. I have no input bindings. That means I'm not taking any input as parameters to this function. I just want to process data. And as an output, I wish to write the processed data to another queue on another topic. In this particular scenario, my trigger is a queue because I am executing my function whenever there is a message on the message queue. There is no input binding in here as I am not taking any of the input parameters from the message queue. But yes, I am again as an output, I am pushing a message on the message queue. So that is my output binding. Let's take another scenario. I have a scheduler job which reads a blob storage content and create a Azure Cosmos DB document. A blob storage is nothing but a storage in which we can keep any sets of files, and a Azure Cosmos DB database is a NoSQL based database where each row is nothing but a document. So I want to run my function as time triggered, which is nothing but a scheduler. A scheduler will execute my function on a schedule, and my function, when executes, it will read the blob content and it will do its process which is the input binding. The content that it is reading from the storage content is nothing but the input parameters to my function. Hence, it is an input binding. And once it is processed, the entire data, it wish to push a document of that particular contents to the Cosmos DB. So Cosmos DB becomes my output binding. So we have a trigger, that is timer. We have an input binding, which is blob content or a blob storage, and we have a output binding, which is a Cosmos DB. Likewise, there are many trigger and bindings. We have multiple Azure services that acts like a trigger to Azure function, and also bindings, may it be an input binding or an output binding. Okay, few of the services are like the blob storage, Cosmos DB, HTTP and webhook, REST API is part of it, service bus, timer, the scheduler, RabbitMQ, Kafka, Redis, and Dapper. But in all, how many services are supported which can connect to the Azure function, and may it be a trigger, a input binding, or a output binding? So in all, we have 21 number of Azure services which can connect to Azure function, out of which 15 can trigger a Azure function, 8 services can become the input binding and provide the input parameters to the Azure function, and 18 of them can be the output binding. That means once the Azure function executes as an output, it can push its output to 18 different type of Azure services, which is very powerful. Hope you now understand what are Azure functions, what are triggers, what are input bindings, what are output bindings. Now let us understand what are the supported coding languages that we can run on the Azure function. We have almost all the major languages that are used in the industry that we can run on Azure function, like C Sharp, JavaScript, Python, Java, PowerShell, and TypeScript. We can use any of these languages. We can create our Azure function, execute whatever we wish to, and we can push the output to any of the Azure services. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like it, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing for more contents. Stay tuned for the next video.